Hey everybody, Paulo Saldanha here, founder of PowerWatts and performance director of Israel Startup Nation professional cycling team. Just reaching out to you all here in my pain cave downstairs in Dunham, Quebec, where I do a lot of testing on CPX of different workouts and different training methodologies. And I just want to reach out to all you, since I know that many of you are either quarantined inside or somewhat limited, and now that all of our PowerWatts locations are closed, we don't have the benefit of great coaching individually in group scenarios, and I know it's probably going to be challenging for all of us in the next few weeks. I know many of you miss your coaches and your training centers. And what I thought I would do is maybe just talk a little bit today about some aspects of indoor training, since many of you are going to move from group indoor training to solo indoor training. I know that I hope that we're going to be coming back soon, and I'm hoping that what we can do is over the next few weeks is offer you guys different pieces of training cues and hints to help you with this indoor training that you're going to be stuck doing on your own for the next little bit. So today I wanted to model my first little discussion here, and bear with me, this is my first Instagram post. I'm a bit of a social media moron, so please forgive me if it's not up to snuff as to what's out there. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about the solo indoor training component that you don't often think about when you're coming to PowerWatts centers and doing group rides with. Well, for people who have started riding outside or who had started riding outside and mixing that outdoor riding with indoor riding at PowerWatts centers, I think it's important that you have to be careful managing your loads. Training outdoors is, although you can do more hours, is something that you have to make sure you balance with the indoor training. Indoor training tends to have a value of about 1.25 to 1.5 times more the load capacity per unit of time, which means for an hour indoors of intensity-based training, it's worth about an hour and a half to an hour and a quarter time. So make sure you adjust that. And if you're somebody that only really did PowerWatts training at one of our locations, then you should be fine doing a couple of intensity sessions a week with a couple of aerobic sessions a week that are more in that lower target range. So it's important to just be aware that your loads might have to be managed a little bit differently. Don't forget also to add the component of strength and conditioning to your indoor training now. We have a few centers that have been able to offer you guys remote indoor strength and conditioning sessions, but even if you don't have access to that, and even if you follow somewhat of a generic program for the time being, it's probably not a bad idea to stack your strength and conditioning program and core program, even if it's 30-45 minutes long, 2 or 3 times a week, on top of, let's say, an easy day on the bike. So a good program for you to put together would be a couple of days of intensity, up to 3 days of intensity, and a couple of easy days where you do maybe a 30-minute warm-up on your bike, easy aerobic, and stack some strength and conditioning pieces on top of that. Be very careful when you move to solo indoor training not to get roped into these platforms that have group training associated with them, just because they tend to make you overemphasize the quality of the training, in a sense that if you're doing 2 very fixed interval training sessions a week and you choose to ride on a platform that has group training on it, you might get sucked into a higher intensity that you would otherwise do. So have what's called intensity discipline. When you're going to train easy, aerobically flush your legs, then that's an aerobic flush. It's not even considered real training. It's considered recovery. So if you join a group ride while you're trying to think of doing a recovery ride and you're impacted by the competitive nature of it, which many PowerWatts clients are, you might get sucked into an intensity that will be too high, and then it won't allow you to be rested enough for the days that you require to put out much higher blocks of intensity that you would normally find in a PowerWatts class. I also encourage you guys to reach out to your coaches if you have any questions for them during this period. I'm sure some of them have already reached out to you, but they might have some helpful hints for you as well. The other thing that I was going to suggest for the solo indoor training piece is to make sure that you add variability to your training sessions. And these are not that complicated to do. You can come up with these on your own, have a little chalkboard or a little piece of paper next to you with your bike on a trainer, and add variability in cadence. For example, work your cadence envelopes. Make sure that you can do intervals at the low end from 50, 60 RPMs, sometimes even lower than that, all the way up to about 130, 140 RPM sometimes. We want to push the envelope on either ends of these things so you can optimize how efficient you are across multiple cadence envelopes. And that's probably a fun exercise to engage in indoors. And the key thing about these exercises is they allow you to create mind games for yourself, to keep your mind engaged. And this is very important to alleviate boredom and to alleviate staleness in your mind when you're moving to a solo training in your basement and you're doing specific interval training as well. I mean, if you just sit there and say, okay, I'm going to do 3 blocks of 10 minutes at 80, 90, and 100% of my critical power, that's probably you're going to find that a little bit boring. But if you take that same interval set, 3 sets of 10 minutes, and you add a cadence component to it. For example, every minute I'm going to go 50 to 60 RPM versus 100 to 110 RPM. And I'm going to vary the intensity every second minute by 10%. So I'm going to go over under a certain target of power, and I'm going to go over and under a certain piece of RPM. It creates enough variability where it keeps your mind engaged, and it works different elements of your training process as well. So that's a hint that I've given to the Israel Startup Nation guys, because many of them have gone from doing fairly large loads of 20 to 30 hours a week, sometimes more, to now dropping that down to 10 to 15 hours a week. And the beautiful thing about the transition there is that we can trump volume, I should say, over intensity. We want to make sure that volume is a thing of the past. We think about working on their gaps while they're moving indoors. And this is something that you should also think about. Not so much the volume piece, but because many of you have not been riding outside so much, except for our friends in Tel Aviv, maybe who were able to ride outside all winter long. But the key here is you want to make sure that intensity and working on the gaps with that intensity is really where it's at right now. We have an awesome opportunity to be able to look and say, where am I weakest? Is it my sprint capacity? Is it my anaerobic capacity, my anaerobic reserve? Is it my ability to repeat anaerobic efforts? Is my ability to repeat anaerobic efforts at higher leg speed, at lower leg speed, at a gradient, on a flat road? And these are things that you want to try and touch on and maybe work on a little bit. Build yourself a little plan, or reach out to us to ask your coaches for a little plan. I know that we've done our part to put together some online coach-led sessions that have PowerWatts rationale behind them and methodologies behind them. Please reach to those links and click on them and follow along, and you'll see that they take you through a series of different exercises and intervals that can add variety and continue to maintain or build your form a little bit if you're consistently able to do this. Another key thing to keep in mind is recovery. When you are riding indoors alone, make sure, again, you don't get caught up in doing too much interval training 5-6 days a week. You want to make sure that you polarize your efforts. So you do an easy day, and then a much harder day, and then 1 or 2 days of recovery aerobically, and then you hit another intensity-based day maybe later in the week. You want to stagger those things across. You don't want to be doing intensity every day. You don't want to mix between joining these group rides and then doing interval training and then adding them all together like that. It may be a little bit too much of a load. The other point is make sure that if you are going to be designing your own little intervals that are based around some of the PowerWatts stuff you've been doing, keep the intervals relatively short, 30 seconds to maybe a maximum of 3 minutes, and play with different intensities so that your mind is always engaged and things are always turning over a little bit, you know. The pieces that are really important when you are using a smart trainer indoors is make sure you're careful not to use erg mode. Erg mode is essentially when you set the computer or the resistance unit to fix your resistance at a given power output. As an example, if you want to do 5-minute efforts at 200 watts, you would set the system to hold a 200 watt resistance, and then you would just pedal and you wouldn't have to think about that resistance. We try to avoid this at all costs in PowerWatts because it tends to reinforce an inefficient pedal stroke, and it's not realistic in a sense that when you're outside riding, you're the one who actually has to generate the power output. There's no artificial brake on there that's put on and forces you to just turn your brain off and just pedal at a certain cadence to not even hold a certain power output. It's just to hold a certain effort. So make sure that you're not using erg mode because, again, it's going to reinforce a pattern that is not necessarily reflective of the one that you're going to encounter outside. The other piece is I've seen in a few pieces of social media now that people are afraid that intensity is going to be immunosuppressive, and they're worried about with this COVID-19 outbreak that it could make them more susceptible. You know, the literature is fairly clear on this, that doing a couple of intensity sessions a week indoors for an hour and a half at a time is not an immunosuppressive impact on the system. Yes, you can do some high quality work. Don't be afraid of doing interval-based sessions indoors. It actually is strengthening to the immune system, especially if you balance it with some easy days in between. Another pointer that you want to make sure you follow is managing the heat. At PowerWatts centers, we always tend to turn on the fans, and have you guys do a workout with the cooling effect, because outdoors you don't have the convective cooling effect, and so we try to simulate that with the fans indoors. And if you're on your own and you don't have a fan set up, maybe try and make sure you get one, because it will actually keep your core temperature a little bit lower. It'll help you manage the heat a little bit better. Make sure that also on a similar vein that you, especially if you're working out in the morning, that you drink at least a 500 milliliter bottle before your workout, preferably half an hour before your workout. When you're sleeping, you're not hydrating necessarily, so sometimes people can wake up slightly dehydrated. In particular, those of you who are drowning some of your sorrows in wine and alcohol the night before. So pay close attention to that. Make sure you hydrate before, during, and then if you don't get a chance to hydrate enough during the ride, try to do so after the ride. But you want to make sure that workout is reflected by a minimum of 1 liter of intake, whether that 1 liter comes slightly before, during, or after. And that's for an hour workout. You might have to uptick it a little bit more afterwards. And you also might want to try and make sure you drink a little bit more throughout the day on the days where you have done a workout where the core body temperature has gone up and you've done interval training in your pain cave. A couple of other things that you might want to do is make sure that your energy intake is somewhat balanced to your energy output. Some of you may not be as consistent in your training now that you've moved to your homes and unable to really go out to any area where you can do some training. If you don't have equipment that allows you to exercise on the bike at least, make sure that you are cognizant of that and you adjust your nutrition accordingly so that you don't start to get that creep up over 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks of body mass or body weight. It's a little bit of a harder road to come back from. If you come back to PowerWatts when we start back up again, and you've also now got the extra goal of losing a couple of kilos, It's not always realistic to expect that you can all do that, especially since this is a stressful time for everybody. But if you can, it wouldn't be a bad thing. We're going to try and hold some of these Instagram activities in the next few weeks to keep you guys informed. I'm going to try and get Dana Leese, our sports nutritionist for Israel Startup Nation professional cycling team. I'm going to try and get her to give a coffee shop stop talk with myself and her, just talking about concepts of nutrition, whether it's performance nutrition or otherwise. We're going to be releasing some interesting interviews coming up in the next little bit with some of the ISN riders and also with Mike Woods. So we'll try to keep connected with you all and keep you informed and give you some material to chew on during this crazy period. I hope that you're all safe and sound, and I'm looking forward to our next engagement.